Hi, Marilyn. I think we're ready to roll. If you're ready to roll.
I'm ready.
Excellent, excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today's session is called Cultural Competent Work with the Elderly. And my name is Mike Bannon. I'm the director of the Bucks County Office of Consumer Protection. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker today, Marilyn Stein. But before I do that, just a few housekeeping issues. We'd like you to keep your speakers muted and your video off through the presentation. There will be an opportunity to ask questions, and you can use the chat box in the corner. Each session will be recorded and made available on the Bucks County Community College YouTube page within a week or two of the symposium. Lastly, in order to receive the continuing education credits for today's symposium, you will need to complete the evaluation form at the end of the email that was sent to you. So having said that, we're going to go into the presentation part. It's my honor today to introduce Marilyn Stein. Marilyn graduated from Millersville University with a BA in social work. She worked as a parole officer in Lancaster County for 23 years. During the tenure, she earned a master's in education from Penn State University in training and development. She serves as vice president of the Pennsylvania Certification Board of Directors. She holds a certified Allied Addiction Certification with Criminal Justice Specialty and is certified in TREM trainer, T-R-E-M trainer, Trauma Recovery and Empowerment Model. Marilyn facilitates a domestic violence batterers intervention group for the Lancaster courts and has taught addiction course in Millersville University School of Social Work. Marilyn is a motivational interviewing trainer and has developed an MI coaching and feedback workshop to enhance MI skills among change agents. Marilyn began MGS Consulting LLC, a training and consultant business in 2002. Her goal has been to strengthen the relationships between the criminal justice system and recovery. In that role, so I'm getting some feedback. In that role, she trains extensively in PA and nationally on topics that include addiction, trauma-informed care, cultural diversity, and ethics. Marilyn lives in Lancaster, PA. Marilyn, thank you for coming today and having us. The floor is to you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Mike, for all of that. It's so difficult to hear those things read when it's about you. And I apologize for the appearance of my cats, who are going to continue to be a part of this presentation. So I'm very sorry about that. If you have pets, if you're in your home with your pets, don't hesitate to invite them, because mine are here too. So I'm just wondering, does anyone want to tell me how the conference has been for you so far, just as a way of getting started? You are welcome, by the way, to unmute yourself and ask questions or just share your thoughts if you would like to at any time. But again, just help me hear your voices a little bit. Does anybody have anything they want to share as we're getting started?
I can say, if I could jump in, I think it's been pretty good so far. It's a little different doing the Zoom or the Blue Jeans thing or the Zoom thing virtually, so that's a little different, but I think it's been going pretty well.
Wonderful. So I have a lot of information, and I won't hesitate to get right into it, but it's an interesting thing in working with the elderly when it comes to cultural competence, because one of the things that we know is that across all ethnicities and across all cultures, aging is an opportunity that everyone will share. I view it as a gift and an opportunity that not all folks are afforded, and yet we also know that it's really a difficult transition for many. And we're going to talk about some of the things that get in the way of doing our best work when it it comes to working with the elderly. So let's see what we got. I'm going to skip over a couple of things, but one of the things we know for sure is that aging is not easy. We associate it with so many negatives. It becomes sort of viewed pessimistically. And one of the interesting things is that for the baby boomer generation, we know that that's also a large percentage of the population. So the numbers of the elderly are kind of increasing. And at the same time, one of the things we're sort of seeing is that understanding culturally is not always something that is viewed through a positive lens. So I ask you to think about this just for a moment. When you think of the older population, what do you really think as you're kind of bringing someone to mind maybe, or thinking about your experiences with those who are in their senior years? What is the picture that comes to mind? And I ask you to kind of just think about it even in terms of the semantics that you use. When you think about the elderly, and you can put this in the chat box, and Mike, if there's stuff in the chat box, would you just let me know, because I'm not seeing it, and I'm not exactly clear on how I'm able to see it, and I don't want to find out now. So you can just tell me. But
I'm tracking it down as we speak, but okay, gotcha.
So as you, though, anyone out there listening, when you think about old people, what comes to mind? You can put it in the chat box, and you are more than welcome to use your voice if you want to. Just unmute yourself if you can figure out how to do that, and chime in. So what's the picture that comes to mind when you think about old people? Anybody?
Wisdom.
Wisdom. Oh, what a nice thing to hear. So with age comes wisdom. And one of the things we know is that certainly the kind of accumulated experiences and situations that older people have kind of lived through provide a great deal of wisdom. I love hearing that. Thank you. Anybody else?
I do. I have some chat rooms. I have from Bill McTighe, physical decline, perceived loss of relevance as being an issue. And also from Nicole, loss of role identity. Both those ones are good ones.
It is an interesting thing how there's this very kind of real ambivalence between recognizing the wisdom of all the gained experience on one hand, and yet the decline physically maybe, and in some capacity, including mental capacity, there seems to be sort of some loss. And the interesting kind of opportunity comes when we're able to sort of balance the wisdom that comes with being a senior citizen, being an old person, because it takes a lifetime to gather all of that, with the fact that there is also some diminishment. And one of the places that we know creates significant disruption, even beyond the physical losses that may be experienced as we age, is that sense, as somebody already identified, that kind of loss of identity, that shift into a period of life where you may have outlived those that have been important to you, and you've retired, so your identity as that work person, whatever your career may have been, is kind of shifted. And there's a sense of, as was said also, this lack of relevance. And so for our purposes today, professionally, what I invite you to keep thinking about is how can you manage both the loss, especially of identity, in a respectful way, so that the identity is reestablished in some form, and how can you also kind of do that by embracing and encouraging and supporting the wisdom. So that's an interesting, it's not one or the other as we consider the elderly from a cultural lens, but it really is, how do we manage both? Thoughts about that? Questions or comments from anyone as we continue on? Our perceptions are so very important. And that's true across the board with culture and cultural competence. But I think with this aging population, it really kind of demands or begs that we literally make an attempt to see people for their relevance and wisdom, to help minimize that sense of diminishment. Does that make sense to everybody? It's a kind of a cross-cultural place that hopefully we're all going to end up. So I want to start with just a brief conversation about what culture is. And so, for everyone, if you have a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen handy, I just ask you to think about your own culture with the start of what I refer to as your personal cultural autobiography. Culture is defined as the things that we have learned and shared with those who are a part of our community. And community is often the people we're closest to. So it's our siblings, our parents, our circle of the closest of those that we know. It is our in-group. It is our peer group. And so we learn from them a variety of behaviors that become the norm. And what I think is really critically important about our understanding of culture is that, in fact, it has been learned. I always put the emphasis on culture as something we learn from the people who are around us, who have influenced the most. So if I invite you to think about your personal cultural autobiography, I ask you to think about who influenced your thinking about how the world works and about what you are supposed to do and what food you eat at various holidays and how you celebrate different things and what things are not accepted and how you were told about authority. All of these things we learn, and we can kind of pile it up under the heading of culture. And what I love about culture is that it always, always, always affords us the opportunity to expand what we know and bring something in a beneficial way that maybe hadn't been offered to us prior. And so for many, our culture may have been somewhat limited by the experiences and interactions of the people who were closest to us, namely our parents, and yet we may have found through education and opportunities to move elsewhere and to move around a little bit and to taste new things that we can expand that understanding of culture. We can learn more and add to our kind of what was the initial recipe of determining who we were. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have questions about the beauty of culture and how we learn it and taste it and experience it? Anything from anybody?
A comment just saying makes perfect sense. Good for me. So we got some comments. Everyone agrees with you.
Oh, and you don't have to, so that's okay too, just so you know. But culture is an interesting thing. And it's interesting to me because sometimes I've been doing cultural competence trainings in a variety of circles for a very long time. And I'm always curious about folks who say, well, I really don't have any culture. And if you're sitting there with the thought, wow, I don't really have culture, I invite you to kind of rethink that. We all have those things that become our traditions and the things that we do all the time and the behaviors that we encourage and kind of expect from the people around us, and that becomes our in-group as in kind of contrast to the people who are not a part of our circle doing things the way we do, and that's some kind of our out-group. And one of the things we know about working with the elderly is that so often our experiences have been limited with an older population because we have not engaged. If we didn't have grandparents in our household, we haven't really learned about a population that was older than us. And so, again, one of the things culture and this particular age group asks of us is, what do we need to learn about the folks who are older that we're working with? And it's an interesting point. And so cultural competence is this kind of, I'm going to move this over a little bit. There we go. Cultural competence kind of asks us to look at the word competence, which, just as it says here, implies that we are taking what we've learned about culture and applying it to our work, our organizations, our systems. We are looking to be sure that our consumers or our customers are being offered what they need, because our competence says we know people need things that are different, and certainly maybe different from what I've needed and experienced, but competence suggests that we have a willingness to reach beyond what we've come to know. And so we ask ourselves, with cultural competence in the elderly, does the system that I represent, and I don't know what systems you all represent as you're listening here today, but does the system you represent, do the organizations you support really work to enhance the experiences and the quality of life for the elderly, or do they not? And so this idea that cultural competence is the bringing together of attitudes and beliefs and policies within our organizations that really do support the needs of the folks that we're there to serve. And in this arena, we're talking about the elderly. Oh, there we go. So we know that healthcare does not always lend itself to the very specific needs of the elderly. And in fact, some of our systems don't even address what those specific needs might be. So a while back, the Office of Minority Health, through the Department of Health and Human Services, as it says here, came up with this thing called the class standards. And what that stands for is the culturally and linguistically appropriate services in healthcare, to sort of be sure that our clients, consumers, are getting what they need in accordance with their cultural needs and their language needs, that we're not always able to provide what is needed if we haven't paid particular attention to the very specific population of folks that we're working with. And so are we able to provide services in the language that people need? And are we able to communicate effectively across the lifespan? Do we understand something about the attitudes and beliefs of the population of folks who are older than us? And can we be respectful of those differences by paying attention? Sometimes I think respect is demonstrated with clients, and I've worked with clients for many, many, many years, just by simply saying two magic words, which are "tell me." And the "tell me" is with an invitation to help me understand what it is you need. And the class standards, if you haven't heard of those, your homework assignment is sort of to just Google and investigate the class standards just a little bit. I know that we, in the Department of Health, Drug and Alcohol Department, DDAP, we pay particular attention to the class standards, and I talk about this quite a bit in the DDAP training, cultural competence training that I do. But I invite you just to kind of peek at these things, to know that there's a real emphasis on our need to pay attention to the needs of the elderly in healthcare in particular. We know very clearly that aging is far more successful as our socioeconomic kind of opportunities and resources increase, and that the gap for those who have the availability of those resources socioeconomically and those who don't is ever widening. So we need to really address, I think, systemically, not just those who have the resources to do well. They have a bit of a boost as it is, but we really need to systemically pay attention to the needs of the aging population whose resources may be somewhat limited. And that's just an important piece to pay attention to. We know that aging in America in particular is a healthcare conundrum, to say the very least, and working with this diverse aging population. Because again, I just want to emphasize that regardless of culture, regardless of ethnicity, the reality is that across the board, people age, which automatically says we have to pay attention to the cultural needs, the socioeconomics, the language limitations, all of those things that make healthcare and wellness as we age a little bit more of a challenge. questions, comments, thoughts about anything I'm saying, because I would love to hear your voices. Mike,
Well,
do
I
you
know,
see anything worth commenting on in the chats?
yeah, I know you've heard my voice already, but no, we don't have any new comments at this point.
Damn, folks, are you all okay out there? Is everybody doing all right? Just a quick thumbs up so Mike can communicate that to me. I know it's late in the day, but we're going to get to some things that you're going to have to do here. So
Got
I
it.
do want to. Oh,
We got it all good, so we got it all
okay.
good for me. So we're starting to get some good comments rolling in.
You know, one of the things that I do believe about cultural competence, and I will say this and just invite you to absorb it for a moment, is cultural competence focuses on what I believe about them more than really who they are. What I believe is critically important in my ability to work with those unlike myself. It is that in the role of change agents working in the field of behavioral health, and I'm not clear on what everyone listening today is actually doing or how you're engaging with clients, but one of the things I invite you to think about with cultural competence in the population you're working with is not who they are, but rather who are you as you move through the kind of day-to-day tasks of performing your job in this field. And I invite you to just think about what were you taught about the elderly? Were you taught that folks who are older than you are automatically afforded respect? Were you taught that the authority of being someone older is something that we were supposed to pay attention to? Were you taught that you should give your seat on any kind of public transportation or whatever to someone who is older than you? And then I also invite you to think about this. Throughout the course of your life, not just currently, but through the course of your life, what has been your experience with the elderly population? Has it been satisfying to know that you're working with those who, as someone said earlier as we started, has the opportunity to share their wisdom? Or do you see this as a kind of diminished population and it's been kind of difficult to get services or provided or take care of what their needs might be? So again, part of cultural competence in working with any population, but especially the elderly who live in all populations, is that how are you able to expand your lens just a little bit? Is there the opportunity for you through a day like today to sort of see things differently and do work differently that would allow for greater cultural competence? So does anybody want to share responses to either of these questions? What were you taught about the elderly, and what have your experiences been? Anybody want to share anything? And if you're a parent of a school-aged child at this point, what are you teaching about the elderly? What are your responses to anything you might watch on TV that includes the elderly? How are those who are older a part of the conversation? These are all really important considerations when it comes to gaining cultural competence with this particular population. And so, of course, that invites thinking about myths. And each of you can go home and just determine what kind of anti-aging products might you have in your medicine cabinet, in your makeup bags. What kinds of things are you doing to minimize the appearance of aging? Have you attended to any of those lists that encourage certain behaviors be stopped amongst those who are a little bit older? What are those things that maybe you've encouraged an older person to stop doing because of their age? And is that the reality for them, or is that part of the myth of the benefits of youth in this country? Thoughts about that? I use an anti-aging face cream. And as I was putting this together, it demanded my thought about, why am I doing that? It wasn't inexpensive. And so what is it that I'm avoiding, or how is it that this became an important priority for me? Of course, we can talk about things like hair color and all the things that cosmetic folks are doing, some of which I may or may not avail myself of.
If I could jump in, Marilyn, one of the
Sure.
big things that I've seen, and it's a very difficult, is driving for seniors. When you list the things that people are encouraged to stop doing, and that driving one is definitely difficult if you have older family members in there, and I've certainly struggled with that.
Yeah, I can recall with some slight degrees of horror the whole task of trying to get my dad to stop driving at a time in his life when it was clear he wasn't doing it safely anymore. And I'll never forget the conversation with my grandmother, who was driving with her sister. They were quite a bit older. And my grandmother called to say, well, your aunt and I take turns. I watch the outer lane. She watches the inside lane as we drive together. I just thought, oh, good Lord, and put the process into place that maybe let's just try to stop this. Anybody else got any stories to share about anything having to do with the myth of youth or any other myth that may be associated with aging? Thoughts about that? Mike, I'm glad you brought up the driving thing, because that is kind of scary, and it's a real indicator of a loss of independence that is determines a very real kind of loss.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of thoughts in the chat room, just so you're aware.
Oh, thank you, whoever said that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Could you read me a couple since you're looking at them?
Oh, well, I didn't know I had to scroll down, so I apologize, everybody. You had quite a few comments in here. My apologies. Okay, so yes, we have yes, personally, the older adults in my life have struggled with continuing to use ladders, steps, and stools. Families encourage them to stop, but in all situations, the older members of the family believe they are still in position to use ladders regardless of their age. That's a good one.
So this idea of safety versus independence is a real wrestling match, isn't it? And one of the myths might be that at a certain age you shouldn't do those things any longer, and that's not necessarily the case, but certainly we need to be cautious. Mike, anything else you want to share?
Yes, I have one here. I have worked in geriatrics for over 30 years and have enjoyed it. My frustration is the lack of resources, funding for assistance, and sometimes frustrating with self-determination competency when there are safety risks. Another good one?
Yes. So this idea of self-determination is such an interesting one because it's right at the core of the issue. At what point does the individual who is aging not know what is best for them? And it becomes a bit of a challenge to make sure we're approaching the need for safety and the respect for autonomy. And we'll get back to that. Thank you.
Sure. One of the other common themes, if I could just say, that comes here is quite a few of the participants wrote in that they learned respect for the elderly from their parents treating elderly folks respectful. So I think that's a common theme I'm seeing here. There's also a comment saying, I grew up in a 3-generation house and have raised my children in the 3-generation house. Of course, this has challenges, but it adds richness to life. I bet it does.
Aw, perfect. Thank you for sharing those, Mike, and thank you for providing them.
Yes, the people here.
What we're talking about really is ageism, and this is a term that was developed by Robert Butler, and it kind of speaks of the negative potential, the language that we use, the way we promote the idea of the preference for youth, the way that there are, the way that the system doesn't always provide what is needed, clearly the discrimination that we see. And it's an interesting situation that, again, because every ethnic group has an aging population, the prejudice, the stereotypes, all of those things that may have existed for someone when they were younger continues forward in its pressure to afford every individual with cultural competence. And again, the systemic kind of discrimination that may exist continues. We just heard it said that the resources aren't really available. And so in order for us to carry forward the respect that I heard you saying is being taught to children, in order to bring that forward, we really have to be allies to the elderly and be voices in our systems that say that this isn't available or this doesn't exist as a resource when we know that the service is needed but not being provided. I kind of really liked this quote that the neglected stepchild of the human life cycle is how he has described the aging. And so, the one thing that I'm always curious about is I heard very clearly that the majority of you who typed it into the chat, maybe everybody, is sort of thinking, I've taught my children to be respectful to the elderly, and maybe that's your experience too. And so what happens systemically? What's the gap between the desire to be respectful, the way we teach our children to be respectful, and then what happens in this lack of resource? Does anybody have anything they want to say about this gap between the way we want the elderly to be treated and then the resources and systemically the things that don't seem to be prioritized? Would you even agree, and I don't know how, as a thumbs up or whatever, that ageism, this idea of sort of discrimination toward the elderly, actually exists in our systems?
Marilyn, I think a lot of times it's learned through our environment. How we might teach our children something, but they might go into a school system and they might learn a different way.
Sure, they might learn a different way, and sometimes the learning the different way is just through observations, that maybe they see someone not being offered the seat on the bus, or maybe they see that someone is not being taken care of or not spoken to in a way that's respectful or appropriate. And the whole idea then becomes, how are we able to stand up for and be real allies to this population across the board, again, knowing that it happens culturally to everyone? Anybody else? And
I do have a comment, not in what we were just saying, but I just want to backtrack if I could for a second. I have a comment here. A big concern that we have seen is with medication errors, often related to forgetting that they took them already for the day, or taking their spouse's medication. Excuse me. So easy to forget. Highly recommend helping family members set up a system, sign out for meds when they take their pills.
I have a little bit of information coming up along those lines. As a person who has worked in the substance use disorder field for so very long, I couldn't do this presentation without a word about this. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but absolutely, what might look like substance abuse could be substance misuse, and it's difficult to know the difference because they look so similar unless we're paying attention. So we will get to that. Thank you for that comment. So this idea of ageism, I'm not sure how you feel about this, but I really do believe strongly that this idea of ageism as a negative really does exist. And again, I encourage everyone to leave here today and maybe challenge yourselves, but especially challenge your coworkers or those who may not feel comfortable working with the elderly or may not be demonstrating the support for the elderly, that you help them kind of take another look at their own understanding of aging. And again, I can't stress enough how ageism is profoundly a part of everyone who was afforded the opportunity to age, that opportunities diminish. It seems that there's less and less opportunity to be paid attention to. And so we know that this really is a hugely impactful problem that starts with, again, something to do with understanding the cultural needs of everyone who is at some point ultimately hoping to age successfully. And that's an interesting situation, because aging successfully is far more, desirable than not. And as folks in the fields that we're all in, we have some opportunity to kind of work within systems that see that success is more possible. And again, if we had all day to talk about this, we would be talking more about our own perceptions and beliefs about this population of folks who are aging. It's interesting, too, to think about the intersectionality of aging. And so if you're in the field working with those who are aging, Tim Crenshaw came up with this term intersectionality a while ago. And what it means is that the issue of age culturally does not stand in isolation or in its own vacuum. It is impacted by so many other kind of cultural considerations that we have to think about all of them. This ecological approach, especially in social work, suggests that nothing about each of us stands alone, that no matter what our identity is, our race, our nationality, our religion, all of these things. And I didn't mean to leave anything out of this visual. It was just sort of one I used from doc stuff. But there's so many identifiers for each of us that intersectionality says we share kind of a lot with some and not so much with others, and that where it all comes together speaks of opportunities and what's available for each of us. And so intersectionality says that I'm working with someone who is older, and so not only is age a consideration, but other issues having to do with culture, including race, including gender identity, including sexual orientation, including substance use and the comfort with recreational substance use, all or just prescribed substance use. All of that speaks of intersectionality. And we can't isolate just one of these because none of them stand alone. We're kind of more of the appearance of what happens for each of us when we braid each of these into who we are. And so again, because cultural competence is so much about who we are and how we see ourselves, I invite you to think of your own intersectionality when it comes to culture. Where is it that you're sort of like and share with another population of individuals, and how is it that aspect of who you are may be something that somewhat stands alone? Thoughts about that, questions about intersectionality, and why when it comes to working with the elderly, we really must work with so many other situations that kind of braid into who an individual might be. Thoughts about any of this?
No comment in the chat box yet.
Nothing? So
Not
one
yet.
of the things that I know can be really an uncomfortable conversation, again, because we might be younger than a client who we're working with.
Sorry.
Who has, that's okay, someone who might be a little bit older, who we're consciously being respectful of, having a conversation with them about their sexual orientation, their sexual identity, what is comfortable for them, what they miss, those kinds of things, may be somewhat uncomfortable. And yet we know that all of those things having to do with sexuality are a part of the identity of the older client that you might be working with. And coming to know those things through appropriate but real curiosity about who someone is matters a lot. And so part of my invitation for today is to think about where, in working with those who are older, are you curious and inviting conversation about aspects of who an individual is that goes way beyond just their health and wellness.
I do have some comments here, if I could jump
Cool.
in, Marilyn. This is from Mars. I would agree. There is a disconnect between our respect, but then systematically not enough assistance to actually have the tools to show them their life is worthy. However, the older and sicker they become. We also have another comment from Dawn. Our social media, our commercials promote ageism and is accepted in our society. It's real.
Say that one again.
Our social media, our commercials promote ageism.
Oh, yeah.
And is accepted in our society. It's real.
Yeah, if you think about tonight, if you're going to watch any television or anything at all, you might pay attention to the advertisements that really don't support the process of aging very well, and in fact work in just the opposite to help sell youth as the really beneficial place. And that negates all the wisdom that we're talking about having such respect for. That's an interesting point and a really, really good one. Thank you for making it. And so, again, one of the things we know is that the loss of identity as life transitions into something different than what it has been kind of is supported by these pillars. And each of these pillars, as I look at them, and if we were spending a day together, we would really spend a lot of time on each, is to sort of consider how each of these five areas, work and performance, safety and money, social networking and relationships, body and health, values and sense of purpose, all of those things kind of are the ingredients in the cake batter that make each of us who we are. And each of them really need to be considered and satisfied. So what I like about this in the time that we have is that if you kind of think about each client, each elderly client, each older client from these five areas, and try to think about finding something beneficial and supportive in each that's really helpful information to come to know. We know that health is so critically important, but we also know that health, where there's economic opportunities, is a little bit better. But we also know where individuals have good social connections, whether that's through activities, whether that's through religion, to have that sense of contributing is an ongoing support. And it has a lot to do almost with this idea of having resources to do well. And we know staying connected is such an important piece of identity as well. Thoughts or comments about these five pillars? I would love to expand each of these so that we had some greater sense of their influence for each individual. But if you just take this with you with some interest in finding out something in each of these arenas with the clients you're working with. So we know what are the things that impact, and they kind of go directly hand in hand with those five pillars, is issues of sexuality, of the loss of mental capacity, the fear and the reality of death and dying. And maybe I've been working with a couple of people who are older who are really the lone survivors. And while their health is being maintained satisfactorily, the idea of being the only one is disruptive for them and something that's needed to be talked about. Again, that shift of identity, fear and concern about resources, substance use disorders I want to talk about just a little bit. And I want to talk about the victimization, the fact that folks are certainly more easily impacted by crime at times. And so I do love the idea of being a baby boomer who's getting older. I fit, I'm 63 years old. I fit that category quite well. And I think that baby boomers who are the aging population for the most part today, have very real issues that may be different from what we have assigned to the aging population in the past. So that's just something to think about. I want to talk just a little bit in the time we have about substance abuse, because as somebody said earlier, substance abuse and the process of aging has the potential to look very similar. What we see for both can be memory loss, disorientation, all the things that you see here, chronic boredom, just that kind of lacking of motivation or inertia that looks problematic and may feel problematic to the individual. These are potentially signs of aging, and they're also signs of substance abuse. And I know, out of respect again for the elderly, we don't want to jump to the conclusion that there's a substance use disorder, but in fact it can't be ignored as a possibility, especially given more casual substance use attitudes of baby boomers who are now contributing to this population of an aging group. I'm not convinced, and there's certainly research that supports the idea that casual substance use as a younger person, as a college-aged person, as a 30-year-old, whatever, doesn't necessarily diminish as someone ages. Somebody had mentioned medications earlier, and it is really important that we help folks who are older not misuse, but in fact use the medications that they're supposed to use correctly. We also need to be sure that our clients have access and the resources to have available the medications that they know they need, that if they're facing financial choices that put their medication use kind of on the back burner, or cause them to believe that I'll use this inappropriately or in a way that I deem possible because of finances, so I'm going to skip every other day, or there's lots of ways that medication use can be kind of managed in a way that affords saving some and making it last longer. And I think we owe it to the well-being of the clients we're working with who are older that we're helping them use their medications appropriately and helping them find what they need in order to maintain better health, regardless of resources. So in this arena, how do we monitor medication use? How do we assess adherence and compliance to using medications the way they're supposed to be? How do we screen for the possibility that there are multiple doctors and multiple pharmacies and multiple prescriptions coming in that are difficult to keep track of? How do we know that someone's able to open their medication, to keep track of it, that they can even see it without maybe having the proper glasses available and the proper lighting? So these are all things that when we're working with clients who are older in medication that we need to pay attention to. Mike, anything in the chat box? Okay. And just a word about elder abuse. This is a population of folks who it seems there is a belief they're more easily taken advantage of. Elder abuse is committed by both family members and those in the system who are responsible for care, and that doesn't always happen. And so part of our responsibility as we become more and more culturally competent is to be sure that we're helping safeguard and offer protection to the folks who really do need it. This, especially with some of the technology things that are out there, and computers and phones and laptops and all of those things that may seem difficult to manage, makes this population of folks just easier to take advantage of through various scams. And it's certainly, cultural competence says, let's be sure we're offering the information that's needed to help each of our clients who are older understand. I also want to say just a little bit culturally about just a little bit of gender, and I could spend a lot of time here, but what we know is that race, ethnicity, and gender become problematic, and that while women live longer, they also have a tendency to be more disadvantaged as they age. Their resources become more diminished somewhat more quickly. And in the work experience that I've seen and in the research that I continue to read, there seems to be less preparedness for taking care of their individual needs when someone has been in a relationship with a partner for a long period of time. And so part of the aging process in our understanding of culture is that for someone whose identity has shifted to now just living solo, being sure that those opportunities are there for her. Crime, I think, is an obvious concern, and we won't spend too much time there, but a little bit. Again, anything anybody wants to say, because I have a little bit of an exercise as we're moving into this a little bit more. But anybody got anything they want to say?
Please chime in, anybody. I don't have any new things in the chat box, but I don't think we need to.
When it comes to barriers to cultural competence and in working with this population, again, I had said it earlier, but it's always really critically important that we investigate and take a look at our own beliefs, what our biases and implicit biases might be, and something having to do with our own tendency to stereotype. So when it comes to stereotyping, that was my initial question. When you draw a picture of someone who is older or a senior citizen, what image do you actually see? We've kind of talked about that negative sense that someone's not as capable, as competent as they had been. How are we sure about that? What stereotypes of the older population might you hold? And how does that contribute then to implicit bias? Implicit bias is that thing that sort of says, I'm not fully aware even of how my belief might impact an individual, but I kind of have a sense that it could. And so here's a little activity I want to ask everybody to participate in, just out of curiosity. You will need a piece of paper, just scrap paper, and a pen or a pencil. Does everybody have that available? If you do, what I'd like you to start out by doing, in a list here, as you see from left 1 to 10, I'd like you to make a list of your most trusted 10 people in your life right now. It might be amongst you, and if you don't have 10, that's perfectly okay. But who do you trust the most? It may be you don't see them often, but you still trust them. One of the things I know for sure, it might be that you don't really even like them, but you trust them. Who are the 10, by name, be specific, most trusted people in your life right now? Does everybody have at least a few? Okay. If you have at least a few, and does anybody have a list with more than 5? That would be great.
I do.
Yay! Anybody else? Neither right or wrong, it's just an interesting question. What I'd like you to do is fill in this information. This is your opportunity for you to gather data about those unlike yourself. Of the names that you listed, whether it was 1 or 10, what's the gender, what's their age, what's their ethnicity, educational background, religion, sexual orientation? This is an interesting kind of just little assessment for your consideration. Your 10 most trusted. Another 2 minutes. I invite you to be thoughtful with this. Your like me list. So pardon? As you're filling this out, I'd really love to hear you share something about what you see.
I have more females on my list.
Okay, you have more females on your list, and you're a female. Anybody else? Thank you for that. Anybody else?
I was going to say the same thing. I have all females. They are all white, and they are all some form of Christian or Catholic, and all straight.
What is and just out of curiosity, what is their age range?
Age range is anywhere from my age, 29, to my grandmother's age, which is over 80.
Anybody? Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else?
Anybody want to chime in? Well, I'll share with you then, Marilyn. I don't want to be the only talker here, but the majority of my folks are older. So I just find that interesting when I look at it. I have my kids, but the majority of folks are older on my list.
Now, it is an interesting thing. Thank you, Mike. That this is called a like me bias. And so part of what we know is we tend to huddle up with and put our trust in those that are somewhat similar to who we are. And this isn't just specific to age. It's not really specific to any one of these categories, but kind of across the board. Anybody else notice anything worth sharing about your data collection here? Because the follow-up question then becomes, how does what you see on this little data collection impact clients? Could it? I appreciate the woman who shared that there's a lot of similarity on your list of most trusted individuals. And I will say this, that's pretty much true across the board, that we tend to trust the most those who are most familiar. And this is a key consideration when it comes to cultural competence, because it's difficult to expand our lens when what is most familiar is most like who we currently are. And for those who are working in the field who are maybe somewhat younger than your caseload, or maybe a lot younger than your caseload, the reality is how is that impacting your clients? What is there in your own coming to know something more regarding your experiences and expertise in the field would be beneficial? Thoughts about this? We'll move on. It's my hope that you'll take a look at your data here and see where you need to expand your lens in working with this population of folks who are older than you. Again, any thoughts or questions about this? And if I had
would say that one thought that I have is, my mother is older. She's going to be 90 this month.
Oh, blessings.
Yeah, but what I find is that I relate very much to the client's children that I often have to talk to, because especially when we were doing a lot of interviewing over the phone, if they had hearing aids or hearing problems, their children were sitting in on a lot of those interviews. So I felt like I don't want to over relate to their kids and leave the client out, but I did find that I was, I related so quickly to their children.
And that's an interesting and curious question about the intentions of the children. And while we would love to think that everyone had the best of intentions for their aging parent or grandparent, we don't know that for sure, but yet this is the individual who is speaking on behalf of that person. And so that becomes kind of challenging, doesn't it, then? Just the littlest bit.
Well, it can be. It can
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. And certainly, though, the limitations of technology, if you are hearing impaired, if you're visually challenged to see clearly what you're looking at or what you're reading or what you're signing, then you have to sort of figure out something about trusting. And we tend to trust the familiar. Other thoughts about this? Here's kind of what I hope, that maybe you'll take this data collection back to the office with you to see, are there any shared or collective gaps in what you see? Because that which is familiar to each of us tends to be our comfort zone. It's where we do our best communicating. It's where we're most comfortable. And as a result of that, if we don't see the column of age sort of well represented, what are we going to do about that? And I think that that's a really important cultural issue. And I actually invite that across the board with all of these areas. One of the places this is a really impactful piece of data collection for each of us is to know that if I'm in a position to hire new staff, am I hiring those who are familiar to me because that's where my comfort level lies? If I'm working with a population that I'm not yet a member of or never will be a member of, is there something here that would preclude my really being able to do my best work? And if that's a limitation, how am I going to expand beyond it? Because cultural competence invites us to come to know something more about ourselves so that we can go beyond even just cultural competence and move into this idea of cultural humility, where it's the place where we do our very best work. Other thoughts about this little activity? I just love it, and I think it's so impactful. I'll move on. And when it comes to stereotypes, we've already talked about that a little bit, but I do invite you to think about where may you have stereotypes that are advantageous to the population of the elderly and maybe not so much. One of the terms that that'll pop up here later is elder speak. Do I talk to the elderly in a way that almost mimics that I'm talking to a child or someone who is much younger? And so, of course, as was just mentioned, we want to be cognizant of limitations in hearing and visual limitations, but not to the point where we're sort of really diminishing a sense of independence and respect for someone in just the way we're communicating with them. So I invite you to just consider your stereotypes a little bit. Because what we're working for is active aging that allows the individual to be as much as they can be as possible throughout their aging process, that we optimize their opportunities for health and wellness. And so that aging is not viewed as a diminishment, but instead we've kind of shifted our lens to see it as significantly possible to do more or do something new than what has been done by this individual in the past. Active aging, I love the idea of it. And the ingredients of active aging are what we see here: autonomy and independence. People want to be able to do what they want to do. Autonomy, I believe, is critically important for each of us at all stages of our life. We really want to be perceived as in control, able to manage and cope, and able to do the things that we need to do. Admitting that those things aren't so easy anymore is tremendously difficult. And so how do we allow folks to have a sense of autonomy ownership when maybe there is still the need for support? Can we help someone believe that they're doing it their way, the way they would want to do it, when they're possibly receiving support that they didn't need in the past? And independence. What is the greatest degree of independence that we can afford an individual while, as was said earlier, while keeping them safe? And so this really is more dependent on that individual's perception than on ours. And this is where conversation is so important. And I know, did any of you participate in Barb Orr's motivational interviewing training? Is that what she did today? I think she did. If if you haven't done training in motivational interviewing, I really encourage you to do that. It is the language of cooperation and partnership. It helps teach us how to approach all humans, but in talking about the elderly, it helps us learn the language of respecting autonomy and independence to the greatest degree possible. So autonomy and independence, take these two words home with you, kind of write them down, recognize how your autonomy, which is demonstrated by living and behaviors that show you are independent, are critically important to our sense of identity. And so we finding ways to offer that to this population demonstrate understanding of their cultural needs as well. What can we do? First and foremost, know your biases. Who is it that causes you to hold back or to offer a little bit less because they're difficult? Who on that sort of trusted 10 activity, as kind of small as it is, who is it that there were kind of blanks in age, with maybe the exception of a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle who you love very much and they're older? Was there kind of a median age that didn't represent the older population? Knowing something about that so that you can expand your lens is critically important to come to know about yourself. In working with each client who is older, what do you know about their sense of autonomy and independence? When we go back to those 5 pillars, how would they respond to each of those 5 areas so that we know something about their sense of identity and the wellness, the platform of wellness that they're standing on? People do best when there's intergenerational opportunities, and that is when we can bring folks together and form a collective of those who are younger and older and of a variety of cultures. That's where we find things to be the most interesting. It's not boring. It's that there is a give and take of that wisdom that is shared. And so in the work that you're doing, even within families, but beyond that, systemically, where is it that intergenerational opportunities can be afforded individuals? One of the things that I've heard from individuals is bringing kids with books to places where someone might want to listen to a story. It helps the kids' reading skills. It helps the kid find their voice, and it allows for a conversation. That's an example of something that is intergenerational. And while I'm not sure what each of you are doing in the work of working with elders, what is it that may be possible in bringing a variety of ages together for meals or just entertainment, whatever? How can you challenge stereotypes and myths that we see out there beyond your own? How can we be an ally to the elderly by challenging the myths that really aren't fair or necessarily true? Stereotypes, by definition, don't hold much truth, but yet we believe them. And if we are aware that something is being believed that is simply not true, or would kind of be diminished through conversation, can you challenge those stereotypes and myths that you're aware of in others? That's being an ally to an elderly. And there's lots of examples as to how we can be allies to the elderly. And I would love to see a list kind of afforded of those things that demonstrate our ability to be a good ally to those who are elderly. And I'm just curious, does anybody have any things that you would want to either put in the chat or sort of say out loud even that would demonstrate being an ally to the elderly? Anything? How can you be an ally to the elderly?
Finding resources for them for, maybe end of life advance directives, like 5wishes.org, that sort of thing, so that, making those decisions and having those discussions would make things easier for them and their families.
It's such a hard conversation to have. And it's a conversation that doesn't go well if it's held off until it's too late. There's this point of no return almost. That absolutely. Anything else? Thank you so much for using your voice here. Anybody else have any thoughts on how we can be good allies?
I was going to say, just by allowing them to share their stories with us. A lot of times they have so much wisdom to give and such beautiful things to say, and just allowing them that space to talk.
I agree. I love the question, in any form of it, doesn't have to be like this, that what advice would you give to your younger self? What warning would you have given to your younger self? What do you wish you had known sooner? What would you have done differently? What would you have done more of that you held yourself back from? And one of the responses I got to that question, and I always think about this, is what would you have done differently? And a woman who was close to the end of her life said, I would have eaten a lot more ice cream. And I just think that's lovely. And it was lovely to hear. Anything else? How can you be an ally to someone who's older?
I have a comment here. Pointing out to older adults when they are stereotyping themselves.
Yeah, and we hear that in the way someone speaks, that like, oh, it doesn't matter anymore, these things, whatever. And I can I think that's an excellent point, to listen for the places in which a particular individual may be kind of stereotyping and limiting themselves. That's really excellent. Thank you for that. I'm actually thinking of examples of that. And for the person who typed that in, can you offer us an example of what you mean? Maybe not. Okay. So what can you do? I offer just an interesting model that I've been aware of, and I've used somewhat in pieces, not always all of it. But I love the idea of accepting someone for who they are and where they're at, without pushback, with just accepting where somebody is, and that includes this population of elderly, to wonder about behavior, to be curious about what certain things, how celebrations, what life was like. I was many years ago a waitress at a hotel that really catered to a population of folks from New York City who had experienced the Holocaust. And I wish I had approached with greater wonder and more interest in the stories that they had to share, because the pieces I remember were fascinating, but I could have done a better job of wondering what life had been like for them and how their behaviors today reflected some of their experiences culturally from before. Ask better questions, show respectful interest, use motivational interviewing skills to really generate good communication. Research culture. One of the things that I find problematic about cultural competence training is the tendency sometime to create lists of who they are and then categorize people according to those lists. Well, they are old. like this or they are like that. And the thing I believe is that's harmful and further stereotypes. And so rather than put people into those brackets, research says, let me ask questions related to culture so that an individual has some sense that I am aware of the context and the nuance of the world where they have lived. And maybe share a little bit of mine in the explain the E so that there's this opportunity to share a conversation. So this is the AWARE model, and certainly there's a lot more about it out there for you also. We really need a different paradigm that sees the needs of the elderly as a greater priority so that resources are more readily available, particularly for those where resources are limited. We know that the resources aren't always available. We know that where there's socioeconomic opportunity, active aging is far more likely. And so how do we provide for, through equity, the opportunity to provide for those who need it the most? And I love this little poem that I found. I think so much of really where I want to wrap this up is with the idea is in each of the clients we're working with, that we see them for who they are and that we further ask and participate in their lives coming to know more, to help us strip away our own tendency to stereotype and our own biases as we approach an individual and sort of see each individual through the lens of tell me. So I think I've lost track of when I'm done. I think it's 4 o'clock and we're almost there.
Sure. Yeah, it's 4 o'clock.
I'm not exactly sure.
It is 4 o'clock, and you've done a great job, Marilyn. It's good stuff. We got about 8 minutes left, or whatever you want to do.
Well, here's the final thing I'd like to ask, and you've been sort of quiet. I'm not sure what that means, and I'm okay with it no matter what. But what I'd like to know, maybe from a few of you at least, is what are you taking with you that you might be able to use in your work with the elderly from a cultural perspective?
Hi, this is Maggie. I was the one who had spoken earlier and had so many similarities between everything in my like me bias. And something I have taken with me from that in particular and the whole entire presentation is that when we first meet with clients, we shouldn't automatically expect them to trust us just because we come in with a badge or we come in and we say we want to help them, especially when we look different, are much younger, have a different background than them. And for me personally, I thought that maybe I was doing something wrong. Why aren't they, giving me the information that I need to help them? When in reality, it just might be their own like me bias. And another thing that I had realized as you had kept talking was that the length of time that I had known these people that I trust is very long. And it's not one day, it's not 30 days, it's, it's years that takes time to trust these people.
I love that awareness because the people we trust most, like you just said, we have some history with, and now you're working with someone where there's no history. How do we establish trust? And the one thing I'm sure you all know, and it's true, certainly, I was a probation officer for 1,000 years. The reality is that the minute I say, yeah, you can trust me, is the minute you shouldn't probably trust me. So how do we establish trust? And I think that comes from being genuinely open and curious with questions like, help me understand your favorite holiday. That gives me a lot of kind of insight into culture. What is it that somebody was celebrating? What are their favorite foods? Were there dietary, restrictions? That kind of thing. Are they eating things that I don't have any awareness of, and how was that for them? Tell me something about that. Can I be curious about someone else's experiences in an effort to establish trust? Because isn't that how we come to trust someone, to know something about them? And in the AWARE model, to sort of share and to give some information about who I am in return helps create that bridge from them to me. Other thoughts? Thank you so much for that. What are you taking with you? Anything that you see there?
I have one comment that's I think that seniors need more role models of healthy and active aging.
And that's an interesting opportunity as well. How can we provide that kind of in real time and in real life, not just sort of in pictures and TV and media, but in real life, see that there's folks out there who are embracing age. I think that's lovely too. So I think I'm out of time. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today, and I get that it's the end of the day, but I thank you so very much. I'm Marilyn Stein at AOL.com. If you have anything you want me to know, don't hesitate to contact me. But thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you do. It's not meant for everyone. Take good care of yourself so you can keep doing it. Be well. Thank you again.
Thank you, Marilyn, for a very good presentation. Thank you very much. I learned a lot, and I'll give you a virtual round of applause, even though I can't be there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.